America First foreign policy. When President Donald Trump was elected to office, he, on the first day, signed into law one of his executive orders immediately, an America First foreign policy. And in that document, and I've got it actually right here before, this was his policy directive on January 20th, the day that he was signed in. He says this is a foreign policy directive to the Secretary of State. Purpose: from this day forward, the foreign policy of the United States shall champion core American interests and always put America and American citizens first. Now, I was cheering that on. Love to hear it. But when we look at how things have developed over that time, and especially what some of our policies have been most painfully in the Middle East, one has to ask the question, are we really keeping to the president's stated objective there, or are we doing something different? And to try to help break some of this down, we have a good friend of mine, Rajan Menon, professor emeritus at the Senate College of New York, also former colleague of mine at Defense Priorities, and just a really great guy. Raj, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Danny. Good to be with you.
It's been a while, but really looking forward to having this conversation with you today. I know we email and text periodically on some of these issues here, and we just kind of shake our heads about what's going on. So I'm really glad to have you on today because of your expertise in this area. But let's start off, with this premise. What is in America's vital national interest for the Middle East? And so let me actually just pose that to you before we get into any specifics. How would you define what is in America's national interest in the Middle East?
Certainly not to get entangled in wars, especially wars that are quagmires potentially, and certainly wars that lead to escalation. So, wars in Iran, Israel's war in Syria, Israel's war in Lebanon, Israel's war in Gaza, one has to make a case that supporting them is in America's vital national interest. What is strange to me is that our interests have become almost completely aligned for the first time, perhaps, that I can recall, with another state, and that is Israel. Now, in principle, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's a very rare event. So one has to ask the question, what is it exactly that backing these wars does for American national security interests and the American foreign policy objective more broadly in the Middle East? I happen to think that this is not a good idea for many reasons.
Well, yeah, you say aligned. I actually wonder if it's more like subsumed, because when I look at what the United States is doing in the Middle East, and how it's changed, and not just during the Trump administration, certainly during the Biden administration, this radical shift, in my view, happened under the Biden administration to where they became almost synonymous. And where there was some little bit of daylight between, it seemed like there was a lot of folks going to a lot of effort to try and get rid of that daylight so that there wasn't any, so that whatever the U.S. did was exactly what the Benjamin Netanyahu government wanted. Before I get into some specifics, and I do have some here, and there's some pretty big ones to discuss here, I wonder if you can kind of give us a little historical context, because that hasn't always been the case. In fact, there have been some cases in the past where American presidents apparently privately behind the scenes told the Israelis to get in line and to back down, or else they're not going to get our support. How have you seen it shift in say, the last 10 years or so?
Well, the most fundamentally significant case was that of Dwight Eisenhower during the 1956 Suez Crisis. There were also tensions between Israel and the United States under Nixon. But in the last 15 years or so, I would say that regardless of which party is in control of Congress and the White House, there hasn't been much difference. So between Biden and Trump, is there a significant difference now that we have a president who says it's America first in his eyes? I think you'd have to really work hard to make a strong case that there has been. So I think in a bipartisan way, the default has been to back Israel pretty much regardless of what it does. Most recently, as you'll recall, Netanyahu was just in the United States. Now, we can get into this later, but the death toll in Gaza is staggering. But politicians from both parties were lining up to have a photo opportunity with him, and he was received as something of a statesman and a hero. It's absolutely stunning to me.
Yeah, I mean, you would not be out of line to say it was like rock star status, that everybody, wanted to look up to him, even though there have been a lot of things going on that are ostensibly grotesquely out of line with historical American values and the things that we have historically fought for. Now, all of a sudden, we seem to be either turning a blind eye or doing the exact opposite. And let's look at some of these specific issues here. Let's first of all look at the situation in Gaza. Now, we can talk about what American policy is, and then we also should talk about what it should be if it was going to genuinely be America first. And let's just start off looking at that, because there has been some pretty disturbing news out just in today. This is from Al Jazeera. I think the actual date on this was yesterday. It said that Israeli forces have killed 115 Palestinians in Gaza as 19 people starve to death. I mean, that alone right there should be a jolting headline, but unfortunately, it hasn't even gotten hardly a note because it's become almost common. And this whole issue of killing 115 Palestinians, this has been happening with regularity over the last several months by Palestinians trying to get food. I saw one of the headlines or one of the stories underneath some of this earlier today, Raj, where there was a guy who was pinned down for 5 hours, had been trying to get into the food because the IDF, after escorting this very relatively small convoy, I think it was 25 food trucks in. Not surprisingly, they started getting swamped with people because so many are starving. And all of a sudden they get taken under fire and stayed that way for a long time. And he says, look, I'm just not going to go back anymore. It would be better to starve to death than to have to fear getting shot trying to find food. What do you make of this situation?
Right. So, first of all, the food distribution now is largely out of the hands of the UNWRA, United Nations Relief Works Agency, and other entities such as the World Food Program, Oxfam, and others. So it's under the control of a kind of an American-backed entity. What is it called here? The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The number of nodal points for food distribution are very few. They are guarded by armed contract personnel, but they're also located very close to Israeli positions. That alone creates the danger of casualties as people line up. Now, the Israeli positions all along has been, when these deaths have occurred, that something was done to endanger or potentially threaten Israeli soldiers. Now, think about this. You have IDF soldiers who are armed to the teeth. You have Palestinians who are desperate for food, trying to get, in the most recent instance, flour, right? It's very hard for me to imagine that a military force that is well equipped and well trained and has no shortage of weaponry would feel threatened by this. And even if it were the case, isn't the routine, and you can tell me because you were a military man, to fire warning shots in the air or something like that? So today we had a report that 115 people were killed. And Sunday, I think it was 99. Peter Beinart, whom you probably know, your listeners probably know, did a show today on his program, and he said the average since the beginning of October 7, 2023, is about 150 people killed in Gaza per day. And he compared that with some of the major massacres that have occurred in the world. So the 1903 massacre of Jews in Kishinev, about 80 or 90 were killed. The Sharpeville massacre in South Africa in the 1960s, about the same number were killed. But this is way in excess of that. And you mentioned that it doesn't get any headlines because it's become routine. And that is exactly the case. It has become so staggering day after day after day that it doesn't get the headlines anymore. Jeffrey Epstein and other pieces of news get the headline. So we've become almost kind of inured to this. And it is also the case that criticizing it or calling it a massacre, let alone a genocide, you run afoul of people who will say that you are congenitally not just anti-Israeli, but an anti-Semite. So the tendency of politicians in particular, even those who are disturbed by this, is to hang back and not say anything. So that being the case, if the president is not willing to say anything, and he hasn't, Even when American citizens in the West Bank have been killed recently, Congress doesn't say anything. And if the press runs stories, but the body politic is not particularly exercised by this, nothing happens. There's no price to be paid. There's no reason for the Israelis to do anything different than what they've been doing.
And why do you suppose that is? Because I mean, President Trump said, at least in public, out loud, is his objective is to have a ceasefire in the Gaza. He wants the killing to stop. Similar thing he says in the Russia-Ukraine war. That's he wants all the killing to stop. And yet, when these killings continue on a daily basis by the Israeli Defense Forces or any of the settlers in the West Bank, why do you think he does nothing? Especially because, like you said, in the West Bank, there was the pretty recent incidents where there was an American citizen by settlers that was killed, and apparently that has the U.S. ambassador has apparently made some kind of inquiries, but not a big deal of so. But then it was last week, there was a Catholic church that was attacked, and you can't mistake that for anything else. That's not a mistake that you can claim. You didn't know they had the big, huge cross on it, and several people were killed, to also include some Americans, and yet nothing at all happens. How do you explain that?
Well, I think to begin with, people expected that there would be a shift under Trump where he wouldn't follow Biden's policy in the Middle East. But what I am struck by at the end of the day is the continuity between Biden and Trump. I don't see much daylight between them. So let me give you one concrete example. You'll remember that between January and March, there was a ceasefire arrangement worked out by the US, in part by the US, between Hamas and Israel, correct? And so the negotiations continued, and then came the phase where they were supposed to negotiate the terms under which the IDF will withdraw from Gaza. At that point, Netanyahu backed out of the agreement. Now, mind you, Hamas had kept its word and delivered all the hostages it was supposed to. Israel had kept its word and freed the Palestinians it was supposed to. Everything was on track, but when it came to the question of withdrawing the IDF from Gaza, which was supposed to happen in the next phase, the Israelis pulled out, and Netanyahu said, well, it was really Hamas's obstinacy that led to the breakdown, and that became the American line. Nothing of consequence happened to Netanyahu. So now we're back in a full-scale war and trying to patch together another ceasefire, which is complicated by a whole array of things that we can talk about. So I think the fundamental mistake was to expect that Trump's America First would translate into some significant change in American policy toward Israel. That just doesn't happen. It didn't surprise me that it didn't happen, I have to say.
Well, and then now that we go on to, you mentioned the ceasefire. Now then there's apparently there's been a lot of effort again to have another 60-day ceasefire. And Trump said about 2 weeks ago, I think next week we're going to get it. I think we're really close. Well, now it's a week after that. It still hasn't happened. But yet that is the stated policy of the U.S. that we're trying to pursue. And yet, as this headline shows here, the Minister of Defense for Israel is saying, hey, I think that we should, I'm sorry, the IDF chief, not the Minister of Defense, the IDF chief said, look, let's expand our hold on Gaza. Let's don't have a ceasefire. Let's don't do this humanitarian city where we create something. Let's go into areas where we haven't been before. And some evacuation orders have been given for parts of Gaza in the middle that they're about to go in more. So that makes it pretty clear that they're not any interested in a ceasefire. But then you have to wonder, what does President Trump's play here? Because he claims to be this indispensable world leader that can make things happen, that he can get this deal, et cetera. And yet when the Israelis are openly flouting exactly what he wants, nothing but silence from the White House.
Right. So let's step back and look at the big picture. First, the death toll. So the Hamas Health Ministry put out not long ago a document that's 1,227 pages long. It lists from the youngest to the oldest all of the deaths, providing the name, date of birth, father's name, grandfather's name, and an identification number. You've got to get to about page 486, I believe, before you come across somebody who's older than 6 months, right? The death toll of children, let me see if I can recollect, about 17,000. Another 9,000 women. That gives us about 26,000 out of the total of 55,000 dead. Now, immediately when these figures are put out, the supporters of Israel and the Israeli government dismiss this as propaganda, saying the Hamas health ministry is nothing but an arm of Hamas. They just manufacture things. The problem is that outside studies now by independent experts who are well recognized and respected have begun to converge. And if anything, they're finding that Hamas's numbers are an undercount. So there was a study recently by the Palestinian scholar Khalil Shikaki and a professor at Royal Holloway College, part of the University of London. And they found the death toll was about 75,000. Now, even that might be an undercount because we don't know how many people still are lying under the rubble. So we've got this massive increasing death toll. We have it being perpetrated by an army that is directly being supplied by the United States. But there's no indication that the president, just like President Biden, says, enough, this has to stop. Now, if you look at the facts, the United States has enormous leverage in theory, right? Military support, economic aid, but that leverage is never used. And my firm belief is that Prime Minister Netanyahu understands that at the end of the day, no American president will openly break with Israel. So there are no incentives. Now, there's another thing. The West Bank now, I'm sorry, the Gaza Strip, we'll come to the West Bank later. The Gaza Strip has been carved up and dissected and bisected by four major corridors. The Philadelphia corridor that runs just north of the Egypt-Gaza border, the Netzarim corridor that divides Gaza into half, it goes east-west from the Israel-Gaza border all the way out to the sea, the Morag corridor, and the most recent one, the Magen Oz corridor. So the strip has been chopped up, except for Philadelphia, that corridor. All the others are named for previous Israeli settlements. That, I think, is very telling because at the end of the day, let's put Netanyahu aside. I think the hard religious right, their agenda, it is clear to me, is to resettle the Gaza Strip. They hated the fact that in 2005, then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon withdrew the settlements. And so that is what I think their game is. But it's not just the religious right, because quite recently, the head of Mossad, David Barnea, was in Washington. And it was announced that Israel had identified three countries, Indonesia, Libya, and Ethiopia, who were willing to take Palestinians who would be, quote, evacuated from the Gaza Strip. And would the United States please give these countries an incentive to agree to actually take them? So the plan seems to be some degree of mass expulsion, either in whole or complete or partial, and then the building of settlements. And the question is, how far down this path do we, the United States, want to go? I think that it is not in our interest to allow any of this to happen, neither the mounting death toll, certainly not ethnic cleansing, and certainly not settlement building. But recall that early in his presidency, President Trump himself suggested, well, we could send the Palestinians in Gaza somewhere else, and I'll build these great hotels, and there'll be a marvel. It'll be the Riviera of the Mediterranean. So it is a little strange to me when people say, well, there is going to be a new America First policy under Trump. I don't see it, frankly.
Yeah. Well, certainly that's part of the gist of why we're doing this show today, because we just want to highlight the reality here. And you mentioned the forced or voluntary relocation of a lot of the Palestinians. A lot of press here of late when Piers Morgan interviewed Danielle Weiss, who's a very famous settler advocate inside of Israel, and that includes in the West Bank. Matter of fact, I think it primarily revolves to the West Bank. You mentioned that a second ago. A lot of one particular part of that interview went viral here of late when Piers Morgan asked her, what about the 20,000? He said, 20,000 children that have been killed. Did you have any sympathy for them at all? And she literally refused to answer the question of it. Well, in that same interview, he also asked her about people being relocated and do they deserve to stay where they are.
Many soldiers told me, some of them from my own family, that they were witness to so much talk and propaganda against Israel. And I think that there shouldn't be anymore any touch, any connection with between the Gaza population and the Jewish state. Let them be in other countries. There's 100 million Egyptians in Egypt, so there will be another 500,000 Gazans in Egypt, and some will be in Indonesia, other countries.
Okay, but if I suggest that we carve out an area of Israel to put the Palestinians, we just slice off. Let me finish. We slice off an area of Israel, and all the Israelis who currently live there have to leave and go and live in another country. Are you happy about that? Would you be happy with that?
You have some psychological need to slice pieces of the tiny state of Israel.
And it just went back and forth like that for a long time where, again, she kind of wasn't wanting to answer, but it was very clear that, yeah, I'm the tiny state of Israel. You can't carve any of that off until the people leave. But the tinier Gaza Strip and the West Bank, yeah, no problem with that. Just get rid of them because she just said several times during the interview, they just can't live here anymore. And according to polls I've seen here in just the last 2 or 3 weeks, large majority of Israeli citizens across all the political spectrum seem to agree to that. What do you do when you have a situation where the Israeli population itself is fine with this outcome?
Right. You know, the protests that have roiled Israel have really been about a dissatisfaction with Netanyahu's governance, allegations of corruption, and his failure to bring back the hostages. It has not been, in the main, against the killing that is going on in Gaza. So there's no public pressure on Netanyahu to stop the war. There are some newspapers such as, say, Haaretz or the NGO B'Tselem who will give prominence to what is going on in Gaza. But for the most part, there isn't any public pressure on Netanyahu. So no public pressure at home, no public pressure from the American Congress, no public pressure from President Trump, no public pressure from American public opinion. So if you were in that position, Danny, and you wanted to continue this war, despite the death toll, what incentive would you have to stop? Pretty much zero, right? And so that's where we are.
And, you know, the part that, I mean, I know you and I have talked about this on and off for almost 2 years now, and I still don't have an answer to it any more than I did before. Maybe you do, is that it's still, I cannot get my head wrapped around how, with that headline, I put it up at the beginning, 19 people today starved to death. That is one of the more painful kinds of ways that you can imagine to die, because you're in agony leading into that. And you know, and we've on our show several times showed some of the emaciated children, because it's this malnutrition, even of those who haven't died yet, is going to be something that's going to be affecting the rest of their lives, even if all the food came in tomorrow. And yet we go crazy in this country about the alleged, and they misused term, genocide of the Uyghurs in China, because they're putting re-education camps or whatever. And we just are beside ourselves with how horrible and awful that is. Yet whatever actually is happening there, no one's being killed, or at least not very many. And yet here we have the wholesale destruction of a way of life of people, and that we're fine starving them to death, however old or young they are, they don't mind, which should, I mean, that just seems like somehow that our consciences, our humanity has been seared over somewhere, because if any other country on the planet was doing this, we would be going crazy and looking for military intervention or whatever it would take. Why is it that none of that is happening here?
It's actually, I hate to say, even worse than that, because in other instances, you mentioned the Uyghurs, and we can talk about other places where there are lots of civilians and innocent people dying. We are not directly implicated in those conflicts, right? We are not supplying the Chinese army to help it do whatever it's doing in
Yeah, I
Xinjiang.
see where you're going with this.
But here, we are not in a position to disassociate ourselves operationally or ethically from what is going on in Gaza. We are deeply implicated in this. So, quite apart from the strategic rationale for not supporting this, there is a kind of moral rationale for not supporting it. I think at the end of the day, Americans should not be wanting to be bankrolling a war that leads to these horrific consequences, especially when it's very difficult to make the case that a vital American national interest is being served. What is that vital American national interest that's being served by this? I don't understand it.
Yeah, I don't see one. In fact, I see the opposite. I see it costing us left and right. There's the moral argument, which we just made. Let's go ahead and go to Syria, too, because, after the Assad regime fell, we were doing everything we could to try and rehabilitate them. And we dropped some sanctions off of them. We took them off the Shura off the wanted list, if I'm not mistaken. We were talking about how we can work with them to bring them back into the region, et cetera, in a good way, et cetera. And then now, out of nowhere, all of a sudden, Netanyahu goes in and starts bombing them. And apparently, according to some of the administration officials who've been interviewed, and this is from today's news, they said that Netanyahu is a madman, that he bombs everything all the time. Well, you don't have to look very hard to figure that part out. But the question is, and then what? What are you going to do about it? But this is the problem. I think you've kind of illustrated a couple of times already in this show, is that the Israelis keep doing things that we say we don't like, yet there are no consequences or no costs whatsoever. So where is his motivation to do anything besides exactly what he wants?
Correct. In the latest conflict between Syria and Israel, they didn't just attack Syrian army positions, and the Syrian army is a mess, by the way, coming south to stop the confrontation between the Druze, who have cousins, as it were, back in Israel, and the Israeli Druze have been agitating for Israel to do something. So the Syrian army was sent south to establish some kind of order. Now, the local Druze are divided. Some wanted to make an agreement with the Damascus government. Others felt that the Damascus government was, in fact, implicated in the massacres that they were being subjected to. But the Israelis didn't just bomb Syrian columns coming south. They bombed Damascus, and not just Damascus, but also the defense ministry. And then they said, we will not allow Syrian forces to come to the south, because essentially what they want is a completely demilitarized zone in the south, with the Syrian Druze acting as their kind of cat's paw, as it were. And so they have full discretion to act as they please in southern Syria. Meanwhile, President Trump met with al-Shara, and as you mentioned, said he's a very attractive-looking guy. He lifted some sanctions. He wanted to work with Syria, wanted to bring Syria into the Abraham Accords, the idea developed by Jared Kushner and Trump to normalize relations with Israel and the Arab states. But the Israelis are going in a different direction. Their rhetoric against al-Shara is basically that he's an unreconstructed terrorist.
Right. And why is that? Because at least according to many reports I read, Israel was part of the deal that helped bring about the fall of al-Assad and bringing in the HTS group led by Jelani, they called him at the time, and now Shura. So what gives? What's Israel's play here?
Which for a time, by the way, the Israelis was supporting, because they wanted, first of all, to get rid of Assad. But now that al-Shara has taken control of Syria, and he has a huge mess on his hands. GDP has fallen by 50% since 2011. Widespread poverty. New institutions haven't taken root. He doesn't have control over the entire country. He's desperate for aid and trade with the West. So this is a man who has his hands full. I think what the Israelis would like is a Syria that is weak and in a state of disarray, and so that in southern Syria in particular, the Israelis can do pretty much as they please. Now, the real question is, right, do you want a Syria that is unstable and volatile and that is a neighbor of yours? Because in such a Syria, forces could take root that are not well disposed toward Israel. Or do you want a policy towards Syria that tries to work with al-Shara and cultivates a relationship that he says he wants, that is a normal relationship with Israel? He even says he would stick by the 1974 disengagement agreement, which Israel has now violated by going into the demilitarized zone and occupying the Syrian parts of the Syrian side of Mount Hermon. So this is a guy who, whatever one may think of him, who out of his own self-interest does not want an active conflict with Israel. He knows that he'll come out of that the loser.
Yeah.
But the strategy has not been to use that opportunity to build a kind of foundation for a new Syrian-Israeli relationship. It's been to keep Syria completely off balance.
Now, let me ask you this in kind of the last few minutes we have here. Look at this from the strategic position point of view. For the moment, we won't look at American national interest now. Let's just look at it from the Israeli side. What is the end state to all this? Because they still have an on again, off again battle with the Houthis, on again, off again with the Hezbollah, on again, off again with Iran. Now somehow also with Syria here. I mean, where is this going to go? How and obviously you have the war going on with Hamas. So you have conflicts on and off going on all over the place. None of them have been resolved. None of the situation, to include Iran, none of the conditions that led to that so-called 12-day war have been resolved. They just stopped shooting at each other. How is Israel going to have peace and security for its people with all of these conflicts just constantly raging and them, firing at people and blowing people up every so often?
Right. So here, even though one may disagree with Netanyahu's policy, and I certainly do, and I take it you do as well, it's important to see it from his side, right? So his premise is the Israelis have military dominance in the area. They're connected to the most powerful country in the world that is a major political, economic, and military supporter that is willing pretty much to allow Israel to do whatever it wants. So it is going to use its military superiority to make sure that all of the countries in the region, Iran, Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, are all weak to the point, and in some instances in disarray to the point, where Israel has total hegemony over the region. I think that is what it wants to do. The second thing it wants to do, I think, is ultimately to resettle the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. We just heard from Daniela Weiss. She is an open advocate for colonizing the West Bank. As far as I know, the United States has not officially moved away from its position that it supports a two-state solution. But the West Bank is now like Swiss cheese. There is no viable two-state solution. And every day, we've talked, you and I, about Gaza for a long time now. Every day, there are expulsions, beatings of Palestinians in the West Bank, land thefts, and in many instances, you have videos of the IDF standing by and watching this. So there's a creeping annexation of the West Bank, which is exactly what the far-right members of Netanyahu's government, such as Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, want. They think that the entire West Bank should be part of Israel. The protesters on American campuses have been given great grief for sometimes using the slogan "from the river to the sea." If you look at the Likud party's founding document, it says that there will be only Israeli governance from the river to the sea. And in some instances, the Israeli hard right, when it talks about the river, it's not talking about the Jordan, it's talking about the Euphrates. But all of a sudden, when it's used here, this has been turned into a vicious anti-Semitic smear when the Israeli right uses it freely. So I think they have a strategy. It is to annex as much of the West Bank as possible, to recolonize Gaza, and to keep all of their neighbors weak and in a state of disarray. And
but can you do that long term? It's worked right now. It has for the time given them hegemony over the entire region so far. But can you sustain that military first punch all the time?
not only I think is it difficult to sustain it because you will essentially be at war on multiple fronts, having already fought a war that has actually been very costly for Israel, right?
Yeah.
In addition, there's an old saying attributed to Nietzsche: if you look into the abyss will look into you. That is, the sum total of these wars, especially the Gaza war, is transforming Israel into a different kind of state, some blend of authoritarianism and theocracy, which will make it less and less attractive, not only to the outside world. Note that the public opinion polls in the United States are no longer favorable to Israel, primarily among Democrats, but even among Republicans, the trend is southward, independents also. But it's also not going to be a very attractive place for the Israelis that Israel would most like to hold on to. That is young, secular Jews who are the future of the country.
Well, we'll have to wait and see how that's going to work out. But I just honestly don't think it's sustainable. You can only use the barrel of a gun to placate or submit, make subservient to all the folks around you so long, and that almost always ends up bouncing back into hitting you. So we'll see if it works out. But in any case, we really appreciate you coming back on the show again today. Don't be a stranger. Let's have you back a little bit before we did the last time.
Thanks, Danny. Good to see you. Thanks very much.
All right. Appreciate that. Thank you very much. And we also appreciate you guys. And we will look forward to seeing you tomorrow on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.